Hello, everybody. So, oh God, okay, this is blinding. All right. So, well, today, thanks for coming and joining what is probably going to be a more entertainment than deep tech-heavy talk. But let's talk about breaking boundaries, a journey through 35 years of console history. And since I'm much, much older than this guy over here, Philipp, I'm going to cover the years from the 1980s to around 2007. And then for the modern stuff, I've got the younger fellow. So let's get right into it. And exactly. Let's rewind about 30 years. And 29 years ago, I sat in my first apartment after moving out at the age of 19. And I was printing out a very, very, very long document on endless paper, and it contained the ROM dump of a PC Engine game, in particular, like Special Criminal Investigation. And the reason why I printed the binary data of the game was that I was developing the first PC Engine emulator on the Amiga platform. So I attempted to write an Amiga 68K 100% assembly code program that would simulate the PC Engine. Now, back in the day, emulators were not so popular, and there was no single PC Engine emulator on this platform. So when the first time came around that my system was able to visualize this particular screenshot for the first time, it was a very, very special moment for me. Second moment I want to share is in 2003, that's around 2 years after the Game Boy Advance was released, I released a developer kit called Ham. And it's a shareware software, or it was a shareware software, that allowed people without any deep technical skills to develop C programs for the Game Boy Advance, debug them over a serial cable directly on the hardware. And it was so popular that even some commercial games were released with it, which made me incredibly proud back in the day. It was not the finest games, but if you want to see one, you can see me after the show. I don't dare showing it here. So, and finally, I did all of this on my Amiga, and I'm still using my Amiga today. And this is kind of the conclusion that I want to get across why we're doing this talk and why I'm telling you this. It is that hacking video games and hacking the video game hardware and making it do things it was not intended for allows us to It allows us to connect the past with the present, and it allows us to rediscover games that were otherwise completely lost and keep those retro platforms alive. And with this, let's go back to the 80s. So, yeah, exactly. This is exactly what kick-ass video games looked like in 1981. Some of you may remember. This is Jungle Hunt for the Atari VCS 2600. So, but the problem with that was I was all of 6 years old at the time. These things were really expensive. So you couldn't really borrow a game from your neighbor to get it. Or you could borrow it from your neighbor, but you can't really make a copy of it very easily. Or could you?
You could.
Oh, look at that. That's a Vidco copy card. That's actually very rare and expensive. So this is the first commercial video game copying product that, to my knowledge, exists. And in 1983, what you would do is you would put the motocross cartridge or Pitfall or whatever it was, it's a 4 kilobyte ROM, and on the other side you put this device that is called a copy card. And then you just press the button and wait for 2 seconds. And once you're done with that, the copy card holds an image of the motocross game. So this is the first copier that existed ever, and it was mostly sold in the US. And it actually works to this day, and I'll show it to you live in the hackathon tomorrow. So, but then the big problem, E.T. Everybody knows the E.T. game, and the E.T. game was widely regarded as one of the most horrible video games ever released, and it actually led to the 1983 Great Video Gaming Crash. What does that mean? It meant that in 1983, the shelves were full of video game systems and games that nobody wanted to buy anymore because a new thing emerged. The new thing was home computers. So everybody was crazy for getting a home computer, Commodore 64, the MSX platform, or Amstrad, whatever it was. Everyone bought that, and nobody cared about video games anymore. So on home computers, you could get games on cassette or floppy disk, which supposedly were really easy to copy, right? Well, it turns out that cassette copies were really easy. All you needed is a stereo system back then. You should probably have a pretty good stereo system, but you could simply dub the tapes because the data was encoded in audio files on the tape, so you could just make a copy of the tape. But of course, it was error-prone and unreliable, and over time, the quality of the tapes deteriorated, so not a great solution. Well, floppy disks. Floppy disks were often protected, and there's a lot of interesting things that the developers came up with back in the day. One of the prime examples of amazing copy protection is the game Giana Sisters, that probably some of you know. One of the things that I want to single out on this is that they had a technique when they made the original disks that they call weak or unstable bits. The unstable bits is actually a section of the disk that was not magnetized as heavily as the rest of the disk. So on purpose, when you would read it with a normal drive, it would not pick up the same value every time. And the custom loader of this would actually check for the randomness in this sector that a normal copying device couldn't reproduce. So this is one of the things, and there's many other things like deliberate bad sectors on the disk that had to be like this, writing in between two tracks, which is the half disk tracks technique, and so forth and so forth. So floppy disks. There's also more creative protections that they came up with and that they shoved in our faces, like the infamous Mix and Mojo from Monkey Island, which is a flywheel that you have to spin and come up with the right answer to the question. And most notoriously, the one on the right-hand side here, the lens lock system, is a really, really horrible contraption conceived by I can't remember the company, but basically you would have to hold it onto your television screen to end up seeing what was displayed on the screen. And if you look very carefully right now, you can actually make out some numbers, but it almost didn't work. It's really, really bad. So this frustrated all the kids. And that's also the reason most of the kids in the 80s that were into computers were the ones that were tantalized by this and freaked out by this. So they would start looking into whether they can remove these copy protections. And this led to the release of the first 8-bit hacking hardware, most notoriously the action replay for the Commodore 64. So what's an action replay? The action replay is a cartridge that you put in the back of your computer, which gives it direct access to all of the hardware. And you could, at any point in time, freeze the execution of the program that's running by just simply pressing one of these buttons up there. And when you do that, the system drops into a monitor mode, and you can actually inspect the RAM, dump the RAM to a disk, and do all kinds of things to it. And you could also manipulate the memory and essentially crack programs with this. And in reality, this is then what it looks like. So basically, you load your program to RAM, and then you freeze the program. Then you look at the point where you are, and you kind of figure out what the machine code is doing, disassemble the machine code, and then replace one or the other jump instruction to end up skipping the copy protection. This is, in an oversimplified way, how it works. So, well, as cracks became mainstream, two new things happened, and one of them was crack throws. A crack throw is kind of a graffiti that's put down by the crackers of the game to promote themselves or to promote their cracking group. In addition to promoting themselves, they actually made customized trainer systems for each game, and they packed them onto a very, very small program at the start of the disk. So you could just start the game, configure it for unlimited lives or anything else that you want to cheat with. And that is basically what happened to pretty much all the cracked games. And you see a countless number of these screens on in the retro game catalogs of the Amiga and the Commodore 64. Also, this gave birth to another computer scene. It's called the demo scene. And the demo scene is basically all this art without the cracking. So eventually, people were bored of cracking games, but they really loved creating tiny little programs that would be able to display really, really cool stuff on old platforms. So this is a scene that is alive to this day, and I invite you to watch a few amazing demos in the hackathon as well tomorrow, not just on the Commodore 64, but also on the Amiga and some other platforms. Okay, well, but I didn't have any of these computers, so I was stuck with this. So this is a Amstrad CPC at 4 megahertz loading games from a tape drive, and it's a quite horrible experience, and I despised it, and I couldn't really do much with it because it was so limited everywhere, and it had a green monitor. It's pretty horrible. But then the Amiga arrived in my home and in the homes of everybody else, and the Amiga was my creativity explosion. I could do anything I wanted with it. And the original model that I'm going to talk about is the Amiga 1200 platform, which is a 14 megahertz 68020 CPU with 2 megabytes of RAM, but it could be infinitely expanded. And these days, the Amiga I have with me on the hackathon is a 50 megahertz with the biggest 68K processor that exists, 130 megabytes of RAM, lots of storage, etc., etc. And basically, this is what it looks like from the inside. So if you want a high-performance Amiga, you have to hack it quite a bit. So there is a possibility of attaching contraptions to the chipset, so it will extract the video information and give you audio and video out via HDMI. Then, of course, you can use compact flash cards instead of good old hard drives because it just works a lot better. You can use Ethernet, you can update the ROMs. Interestingly, Amiga OS still ships new updates to the operating system 33 years later. Then there's modern accelerators that you can buy, you can switch out the floppy disk, and so forth and so forth. So this is the Amiga, and just to illustrate, you can actually use the Amiga to surf the internet. And you can actually post on the internet in social networks like Mastodon on your Amiga today. So, but to conclude this, the realities with these kinds of machines is that they're very, very picky in terms of how they function or don't function. So more than half of the time, my Amiga actually looks like this, and it breaks easily, and whenever you have to replace anything, it's a nightmare. So if you really want one, be ready for a lot of pain. Right. Finally, switching to consoles. But there wasn't that many consoles and not that much console hacking apart from the Atari card because console development at home was impossible. So unless you had a license from Nintendo or from Sega and you would get the official development kit, you would not have any tools. You would not have any docs. You would not have any way to run your code. There were no emulators to speak of at all. And there was no online community because there was no internet. So how did we start hacking video game systems then? Well, the pirate scene, again, came to the rescue. And what you could actually do is, if you had the contacts, you could find a BBS system. Just quickly, who knows what a BBS is? OK, I'll explain that. All right. So a BBS is basically a system that looks like the thing up there with the 4 modems stacked on top of each other, which are connected to phone lines. And it's running kind of this terminal-like program that you can dial into from your computer. So I would just have this number, which was usually secret, that you could dial into, and then you had this hookup, and you basically had a text-based menu to interact with the remote system. And this text menu, the main menu here, you could actually see it, that you could list files on there, you could read messages. So it was pretty much an online community, except for that you had to call in with your phone, do your stuff, and then leave again. But these things actually hosted all the files you wanted if you had the right BBS access. And you could get the official Nintendo SDK. You could get all kinds of cool tools. Right. But that still didn't give you hardware, right? And hardware is also something that you were only, to my knowledge, able to get via sellers on these BBSs that advertised in text mode on the BBSs, and then you would call this flaky number in the US and make a deal with them, and then they would ship you this hardware. And, well, another way I want to single out, just for you, Martin, is I've actually bought my Xbox dev kit in the London Tube. So there were also some other channels how you could do that, but I'll save the story for that for another day, but it actually happened. So how you would interact with these contraptions was usually in the early 90s via the parallel port. So I don't know whether people still know what the parallel port is, but basically this is what printers connected to in the 90s. And you could also basically, the parallel port means that multiple data lines at the same time can be transmitted. The serial port really had one line that could be 0 or 1, so the parallel port was much faster and very good for transmitting large amounts of data. And this is how you connected your Amiga to the Super Wildcard, and then you could actually run Super Nintendo stuff on it. Not just games, but also anything you programmed yourself, like, for example, this one. So the demo scene is not just limited to home computers, but actually the demo scene exists everywhere on all bespoke console platforms, and this is a production from a demo party in 2014 where they execute this code on the Super Nintendo and compete for the best product. Okay, as the 90s came along, this way of doing things was getting more and more popular, and a lot of different hardware was shipped for the Nintendo 64, for the Mega Drive, for all kinds of platforms, including the Game Boy. Usually these were only able to load one game at a time, but they were pretty powerful for the day, and I owned quite a lot of those. But modern-day replacements came along. I just want to quickly skip to the present for this. If you want to do this today, all you need is a cartridge with a SD card slot and a USB slot, and off you go. It's much, much easier today. So as the middle of the 90s passed and internet was starting to get more easily available in Germany, I started making portals about all the hacking and all the documenting that I had done, and launched a series of hack sites and emulation sites, and promoted my own emulators, etc., etc. And there were quite a few popular sites. The most popular and the most venerable of them is Zophar's Domain, which is an emulation and computer and console documentation site that's been around for 27 years or 26 years or so. It's pretty crazy. Zophar's Domain, absolute go-to website when you're looking for documentation. Okay, now we're going to go a bit more into the current. It's around 25 years ago or 20 years ago, the CD-based consoles of the 90s. I'll give you a quick worldwide tour in case you're interested in any of those. I put a QR code for each console on the lower right. If you're looking for information about development for the console, this is the code to scan, because we're going to have to go pretty quick. So the first one I want to show in timing sequence is the Philips CDI, and the Philips CDI doesn't really get a lot of homebrew software because it was so bad that hackers had no intention to work with it, and nobody ever hacked it, and nobody actually shipped any hardware expansions or hacking tools in hardware for it. So the Philips CDI is just useless, but if you want to see one once, you should check out the Zelda game that exists for it. It's by and large the worst Zelda game in existence, and it's only on CDI, so you should have it. Right. Then we've got the Sega Mega CD, which is known for notoriously bad full-motion video, and I've just given you this small snippet here. It doesn't do it justice. It's actually worse than it looks here. It's the worst full-motion video that you've ever seen in your life, but it's also the first console that actually made it possible in the mainstream. It was probably the first real mainstream gaming console that used CDs, and it was launched in 1991. And it's not very powerful, but dev kits for it exist, and you can actually hack it pretty well. There's a lot of good expansion cartridges for it these days that can both simulate the original cartridge slot as well as the CD subsystem on a FPGA. Then we've got the PC Engine CD-ROM 2, which is lesser known here in the West because it was only launched in the US and in Japan. And it's a very interesting console. That's actually the console I wrote the emulator for. So it uses an 8 megahertz 8-bit and 16-bit CPU, which is very unusual. So it has certain instructions that operate on a 16-bit bus, but most of the instructions are basically the same as the 6502, which is in the Commodore 64. Okay. Yes, there's still modern dev kits for it around, and there's also lots of hardware expansions for it, such as the Super System SD drive by TerraOnion. I think I've got one with me if you want to see it tomorrow. Okay. The next one is a great hacking target, but it's very difficult to get your hands on one of those. So what is this system? The FM Town Smarty is a Japanese-only system, and it was host to some of the best arcade ports of the 90s. It has breathtaking software. It has 256 colors, and it's got a good CD-ROM drive, etc. The only problem with that is that all the games and everything that you want to buy for it is ridiculously expensive. So if you can find a system, you should totally modify it and add a custom optical device emulator for it. Oh, I've never explained what that is. So what is an ODE? Optical device emulator, which means basically a replacement hardware that you can put in instead of the CD-ROM. And usually these things take SD cards or USB connections. In some cases, even you could put your SATA hard drives into it. And basically what it allows you is to play the whole library without owning a physical CD. And of course, it's also great for hacking because you can load any code that you want via the CD drive or the replacement of the CD drive. And these ODEs, they're always listed here on each of the slides. They're pretty much available for most popular systems. So with that said, there is an ODE for the Panasonic 3DO. There's another system that just came before the PlayStation, and it was the system that had the best graphics before PlayStation. So that was only a very brief period of 1 year where the most advanced console was the Panasonic 3DO, but then a year in, it actually suffered a lot because PlayStation wiped the floor with them. And today, it's a pretty sought-after item. It's also very hackable. There is no encryption, by the way, on all of the systems we've seen. So if you can burn a CDR, they'll run in all of these machines if you've got a good CDR quality. So there's no security in any of those whatsoever because people didn't assume that you would be easily able to burn CDs. But you could. There's still a small homebrew scene and a dev kit available for those, and finding an ODE for it is difficult, but there's a new one in development now. The MNEMO is manufactured in Russia, and it's very hard to get a hold of, especially today. So then, can we just skip that? This is a horrible console. It's an Amiga, all right? It's the same as an Amiga 1200, but it's just harder to expand. It's harder to homebrew with it, and it's the console version of the Amiga 1200. Skip that, get an Amiga 1200 instead. And then finally, and we're going to go into a bit more detail on this one, the Sony PlayStation, right? Great hacker target. Sony even released a special version of the PlayStation console for developers, and you could buy this. It's called the NetYarozi system, and you could buy it and put it into your home and connect it via, I forgot what the connection was. You could connect it to your PC and load code into it, but most people couldn't afford this kit, and it was also only available for a brief moment in time. So people looked for other ways of defeating security and running custom code or pirate games on these systems. And it was not long until they discovered what is called the wobble groove. So what's the wobble groove? It's an area of the CD on the very inner ring that is not writable by a normal CD writer, and the PlayStation drive is able to check for the presence of this wobble groove. So basically, if you're asking yourself, what did the modchits actually do in the PlayStation? They simulate the wobble read. That's it. And then the system thinks that the disk is genuine after reading the wobble. However, you could also trick the PlayStation by inserting an original game and waiting for just the right time after the wobble was read, and then just swapping it with your CDR, and it works. Seriously, it really does. this is how piracy was done even before mod chips, and it works to this day. You can try it. So the wobble read, pretty cool. So, and there's more swap tricks to come, by the way. So 1994, the Sega Saturn launched, I think, a day before PlayStation in Japan, and it was a very advanced system. Very advanced meaning very complicated, and it's very hard to program for because it comes with 4 different processors that all need to be controlled separately and that can block each other, and it's very difficult to work with it. So not a lot of homebrew exists, and not a lot of demos for it exist as well. But it's a very interesting system, and as of recently, like as in the last 5 years or so, finally the copy protection was figured out, and the optical device emulators are now available for you to tinker with. So that's the Sega Saturn, but if you don't have an optical device emulator, you could also do a thing like this. So the Sega Saturn had the same wobble area, or something similar to the wobble area, on the outer side of the disk, also so far out that no CD burner could actually write into this area. And on the very outer side was basically the proof that it's an original disk. So one way that you can do is applying the Rings of Saturn hack. And the Rings of Saturn hack is basically you laser cut a hole into an original disk, and then you burn the content of what is called the Sega Saturn system disk onto a mini CDR, and the system disk actually allows you to disable the DRM. It was given to developers, and fortunately, somebody from the hacking scene was able to get their whole hands on one of those, because you insert disk, after it you can boot CDR, and you can build one of those disks yourself from some original game that you don't like, and inserting another disk in the middle of it. It actually works. So, and of course, there's also a swap trick for the Saturn. It's a bit more involved. If you want to have a look at this, you start with the copy, and once the device boots up, you wait for it to not load. So this is basically what happens when, oh yeah, this is how it works, right? Yeah, okay, so you have to know the right timing to exchange the original game. So now it will read the original game, but not start it because it's... OK, and now you reset it again after it starts, and then at the right time you swap back for your copy, and it will work. Yeah. It's pretty crazy. But all of these work to this day because none of these systems could be patched, which is the beauty of the old systems, that once the system shipped to you, it was not online, it could not be patched, it could not be updated, so it'll work forever. That's the Saturn swap trick. So finally, a better solution to this, because this will wear out your CD drive over time, is the so-called no-swap booting, which you can achieve by using an easily available Action Replay Plus cartridge. It's on eBay for 20 euros or so. And once you manage to install a software on it using the swap trick, called sudo Saturn Kai, you can actually just boot up your Saturn, and it will come up with the user interface, and then you can just swap out or put in your pirate disk, and it will work. So that's a much better version of doing it, unless you have an ODE, which is even better. So, and then finally, the last one of the 90s is the Sega Dreamcast, and maybe some of you will know it. It was hacked within, I think, 6 months of launch, and it was hacked in the worst possible ways, because all you had to do is get a patched game inserted into your Dreamcast, and it would just boot. So how did this work? It's a cracker group called Utopia that made what is called a Dreamcast CD loader that could be integrated with the game. So you didn't even have to start the Dreamcast loader, but you could just integrate it with your game and then just bootleg copies or any unsigned code that you want on it. And it existed, 6 months within release, and the pirate scene was rampant. Okay, so I'm told to be quicker. I will. Okay, so yeah, you can actually do on-device debugging. You can do really, really cool things with the Dreamcast. I've done a lot of development on the Dreamcast with a cross-compiler chain with GCC and GDB, and you can hook it right up to your broadband adapter or serial cable if you have one, and it allows really good software development. Right, PlayStation 2 is very hackable, it's well supported, but modding it was a pain in the ass. So until in 2008, a new mod was discovered called FMCB, which works on all PS2 models, and it needs no hardware modding at all. So basically, they found out that the PlayStation 2 checks certain files on the startup of the system, and they found a way to redirect execution to a custom file that is on the memory card, and basically that allows the execution of unsigned code again, and basically this is how you do it. And there is another program that you can put on top of it, which is called OPL, and OPL is the Open PlayStation Loader, and you can hook that up to the network and actually load your ISO games over the network from a NAS. And this will give you total profit because literally you can have 2 terabytes of games readily available to play on your PS2, and it's also amazing for hacking. All right, and this concludes my part, and then it's off to you.
Thank you very much. So, as you've noticed, things got a lot harder, and in order to understand the present and or the future, we have to go back, but don't worry, just briefly. In the 60s, like way before the first consoles came out, there was this phenomenon called phone phreaking. It was done by using this whistle, which came with the Captain Crunch cereal, to imitate the signal that was made in AT&T, for example, like an American phone company, to make calls. And some people, they found out that you could make free calls using this whistle. And there was one man who actually gave himself the name Captain Crunch, who made a blue box that imitates the same signal. And it was used to make free calls as well. And in the 70s, actually in March 5th, 1975, there was the first gathering of what was about to be known as the Homebrew Computer Club. And this is the first bulletin of that club and the first newsletter, which came out 10 days later. So, back then, computers looked like that. If you're struggling with Windows or macOS these days, good luck with this one.
Aren't you supposed to talk about the future?
Yes, we're getting there. So, and back then, the focus of the group members was to actually make this thing more accessible to the public so people could actually enjoy it, because not a lot of people were getting behind that. And this was also the inspiration for the Apple I, which was developed by Steve Wozniak. So, fast forward to the new millennium. Like back then, game systems were very intuitive, like the DS had a great menu, the Wii was super intuitive, you were just pointing at what you wanted to do, and it started. But the scene changed. And as they didn't have to deal with making things more accessible, they were focusing on how could you unlock all the things that the developers were blocking. Also, as you just saw on the previous slides, all of the hacks were still hardware-based. Until this one day in 2008, one of the hacking groups called Team Tweezers, they found out that you could hack the Wii console without any hardware by modifying a save game that loads this particular part in the game, and boom, you're in. And then this happened, and ladies and gentlemen, the Homebrew channel. So, this was installed directly into the menu of the Wii back then, and you could just open it and install anything that you could get your hands on without any complicated hardware mods and without having to brick your system. There's like a couple of different areas in the Homebrew. For example, apps. You wanted to play DVDs on your Wii? There's Homebrew for that. You wanted to play video files? There's Homebrew for that. And if you wanted to connect your PlayStation 3 controller to your Wii, there's homebrew for that too. TCP, this saved my life once. My SD slot was broken and I could not remove the SD card anymore, so I just connected via TCP, like the internet connection, and accessed the SD card from my computer. Easy. And this is the best part. If you were a creative person, then you won with these. The first one on the left is the LSDJ tracker for the original Game Boy. And if you can see it's very complicated. But if you finally got around how to use it, it sounded amazing. The next version was the Nitrous tracker for the DS. And you could record sounds with your microphone, pitch them, make songs out of it. It was amazing. And if you were like the graphics guy, you had one-bit paint. You could paint in one color. So this one actually goes to the current generation of consoles, the Switch. These games were basically only available for computer. And people who were very talented, they just ported everything to the Switch. Because why not? This is also one of the main aspects why people do homebrew. They want to develop stuff for, in this case, newer, but also older consoles, because it's fun. And here you see Unreal, the first Unreal game running on a Switch. Also, tomorrow we're going to show you in hackathon how to exactly do that. There's so many more. That's the main question. Can it run Doom? And yes. People tried, actually they did it, they replaced the common theme of Hello World and just removed it. And now if you're like good at programming, you port Doom to everything. Here you see Doom running on a Texas Instruments calculator. There's an ATM, there's a printer, there's a camera. And the second one is Doom runs in Doom 2. Anybody knows what the next one is? It's a sex toy. People got Doom running on that. And yeah, the next one is just for laughs. It's an Etch-a-Sketch, it's not real. So this is amazing. Anybody here heard about ScumVM? Nice. This is not an emulator. It's more like a virtual machine or interpreter for adventure games at first. These guys, they started in 2001. They made it available for everything that you can imagine. It's amazing. So you can see on the left, it runs on DS, it runs on the Switch. The video is actually running a Wii. And if you're wondering, what else is it available on? Well, not much.
Yeah, seriously, it's like the most ported program I know. It runs on anything. Of course, it runs on Amiga, right? But it will run on anything that has a CPU, pretty much. So if you want ScumVM on any of your hardware, easy.
We'll do this tomorrow as well. And actually, the Amiga was the first reason, one of the first reasons why this was invented, because LucasArts stopped using it, stopped developing games for Amiga, and there was this one guy who wanted to actually convert the game for free for LucasArts. They said no. And, well, a couple of years later this happened, and everything is just available on everything. So after a while, a couple of years ago, they started implementing the Adventure Game Studio engine as well. And if you know what that means, 1,000+ games were available to be played everywhere using this. Oh,
sorry. Okay, and pretty much I've gone all out and came with the motorhome to bring 3 XXL moving crates of all this old shit to Code Talks. So tomorrow at 2 p.m., if you're up for it, and if you want to try out some of these contraptions yourself and see how to work with them, creating a floppy disk or like using the parallel port with a 25-year-old PC, come along and try some hands-on console hacking with us tomorrow at 2 p.m. And I think that's a wrap, right?
That's a wrap.
That's a wrap. Okay.
Holy shit. That was so cool.
Questions?
I have a ton, but I will stick to 2, and then we can talk about the rest. Sure. Okay, maybe really quickly. Honestly, just one thing. I felt like watching a movie, like a really good movie, and then, you know, afterwards, if it's done, you're like actually sorry for having watched it, because you can't watch it again and then experience it again. That was like literally how I felt just now.